The fall took 11 seconds. He counted them because his mind was still working even though his body had already decided otherwise. His name was Rin, and 6 minutes ago he had been kneeling in the Ashen Peak Sect's training ground. 5 minutes ago his master had placed both hands on his chest and destroyed his cultivation core. 4 minutes ago his master had called him a disappointing investment. 3 minutes ago his master had told the assembled disciples that Rin had been stealing sect resources. 2 minutes ago Rin had understood that none of it was true and all of it was intentional. 1 minute ago 2 senior disciples had carried him to the cliff's edge on his master's order. 11 seconds ago they had let go. He hit a ledge halfway down and kept falling. He hit branches near the bottom and kept falling. He hit the ground in a place that didn't look like anywhere he had ever been. The trees were wrong, the light was wrong, the air pressed against him with unfamiliar weight. He lay on his back and looked at the sky, which was the wrong color too. Something enormous was watching him from the silence of this place. He could feel it the way you feel a room change when someone walks in. He decided not to move until he understood what he had landed in. His core was shattered, which meant he had no cultivation left at all. His left arm was broken, his ribs on the right side were broken, and something in his back was wrong. He had trained for 9 years inside the Ashen Peak sect and had nothing to show for any of it. He was 22 years old and had been thrown off a cliff by the man who called himself his teacher. He closed his eyes and took inventory of everything that was true and everything that wasn't. 3 years ago Rin had been the most promising outer disciple in the sect's lower division. He had no spiritual root at birth, which was supposed to make cultivation impossible. He had done it anyway through a combination of technique, discipline, and stubbornness that his master had once described as remarkable. His master's name was Elder Voss, and he had recruited Rin personally from a village on the mountain's eastern slope. He had told Rin that talent without a spiritual root was rarer than talent with one. He had told him that a disciple who built strength from nothing would surpass disciples who were handed strength at birth. Rin had believed all of this because he had been 19 and had wanted it to be true. He had spent 3 years cultivating from absolute zero, slower than every peer, more disciplined than any of them. He had reached the 4th level of the mortal realm without a spiritual root, which had never been done in the sect's history. Elder Voss had presented this achievement at a sect assembly and taken credit for the teaching method. 3 other sect elders had wanted to examine Rin's cultivation technique and study how he had done it. Elder Voss had told them the method was proprietary to his lineage and declined to allow access. 6 months ago Rin had understood why. Elder Voss had been refining his own cultivation using energy siphoned from Rin's breakthroughs. Every time Rin advanced a level, Voss had quietly taken a portion of the overflow energy for himself. Rin had no proof of this and no one he could tell without being dismissed as a disciple accusing his master. He had kept training and said nothing and waited for a moment that never came. Instead, the moment that came was Elder Voss deciding he had extracted everything useful from the arrangement. Instead, the moment that came was 2 senior disciples at his door before dawn. Instead, the moment that came was the training ground, the assembled sect, the lie about stolen resources. Instead, the moment that came was the cliff. Something moved in the air above him. Not wind, not an animal, something with deliberate intention that bent the air as it moved through it. He opened his eyes. The sky was deep violet, which was not the sky above Ashen Peak. The trees around him were silver-barked with leaves that were dark and luminescent at the edges. He was not below the cliff. He was somewhere the cliff had not been aiming. The thing that had been watching him moved again, closer now, and the air pressure changed. A voice arrived that was not sound, it was information arriving directly into his understanding. It told him he was in a domain that had been sealed for 300 years. It told him he was the first living person to enter it since it was sealed. It told him he had entered because he had fallen from exactly the right place with exactly enough nothing left in him to pass through. A shattered core created a specific kind of void that the domain's boundary recognized. He asked, without speaking, what the domain was. The answer came in layers, each one larger than the last. It was the remnant space of a god who had dissolved 3 centuries ago. Not dead, dissolved, which was different. When a god dissolved, they did not cease to exist, they became the space itself. Everything in this domain was the god, the trees, the air, the violet sky, the pressure he felt from every direction. He was lying in the remains of a divine being and the remains were aware of him. He asked, without speaking, why it was telling him this. The answer was simple and took a long time to arrive. It said he had a shattered core, which meant he had nothing inside him. It said nothing inside him meant there was room. The pressure around him increased slowly, not painfully, the way a room fills with warmth. Something was moving into the space his shattered core had left behind. He understood what was happening before it was finished. A god's dissolved remnant was using his empty core as a vessel. Not possessing him, not controlling him, filling the space the way water fills a container. He lay still and let it happen because he had nothing left to lose and nowhere else to be. The process took what felt like several hours. When it was finished, he sat up. His ribs were healed. His arm was healed. His core was not shattered anymore. It was something else now, something that had no name in any cultivation manual he had ever read. He looked at his hands and they looked the same. He tried a simple circulation technique, and the energy that moved was nothing like spiritual energy. It was vaster and quieter, and it moved like something that had been waiting an extremely long time to move again. He spent 3 days in the domain before attempting to leave. He used the time the way he used everything, methodically, without wasting a single hour. The god's remnant communicated constantly, not in words, in understanding. He learned that the domain had been sealed because the god's dissolution had been violent. He learned that the energy inside him was a fragment of divine authority, not divine power. Authority and power were different things, and the difference was important. Power could be measured and countered and exhausted. Authority simply was, the way gravity simply was, the way time simply was. He learned that the fragment inside him would grow with use, not with training. Every time he used it, every time he made a decision it recognized as carrying real weight, it would expand. He left the domain through the same boundary he had entered, which required him to find it. He found it by feeling for the edge of the awareness, the place where the god's presence thinned. He stepped through and the air changed back to the normal air of the mountain's lower slope. He stood at the base of the cliff and looked up. The drop was significant. He understood why no one had found him, because anyone who looked down from the top would see the rocks and the forest and assume. He walked away from the cliff without looking at it again. He had 3 decisions to make, and he made them in the first hour of walking. He was not going back to the Ashen Peak sect. He was not going to Elder Voss. He was going to find somewhere to exist quietly until he understood the full shape of what had happened to him. There was a town 3 days south of the mountain called Drenwick. He had passed through it twice on sect errands and knew it well enough to disappear into. He arrived on the 4th day, hungry and unremarkable in traveling clothes. He found a job the first afternoon, carrying stock in a market warehouse. The pay was enough for a room and food and nothing else. He took it without any visible dissatisfaction. The warehouse owner was a large man named Koto who asked very few questions and expected consistent work. Rin gave him both of those things and was left alone, which was exactly what he needed. He spent his evenings in the small room learning the boundaries of what he now carried. He did not practice in any visible way. He simply sat and let the authority move through him and observed what it did. It was interested in truth the way a compass is interested in north. When people around him lied, it registered the lie with a warmth that was almost tactile. When something was unjust in his immediate environment, it created a specific pressure that was hard to describe. He noted all of this and said nothing to anyone. 6 weeks into his time in Drenwick, he found his ally. Her name was Kala, and she worked in the town's records office as a junior archivist. She was 20 years old, methodical, and had the specific expression of someone who had noticed something they couldn't yet prove. He found her at a tea house on a rest day, reading through a ledger that was clearly not her own. He sat nearby and asked, casually, whether she had found what she was looking for. She looked up with the expression of someone ready to deny everything. He said he wasn't asking because he intended to report it. She studied him for a moment and then said she had been trying to trace a discrepancy in the regional cultivation tax records. He said that was interesting and asked what kind of discrepancy. She said the kind where a senior sect elder's reported income didn't match the energy transfer records from 3 years of disciple advancement fees. He was very still for a moment. Then he asked, very carefully, which sect elder? She said Elder Voss of the Ashen Peak sect. He ordered another cup of tea and told her he might be able to help with that. Elder Voss had been having an excellent 6 months. The disposal of Rin had gone cleanly, no investigation, no questions from the other elders. He had framed it well, the theft accusation, the public dismissal, the cliff as a mercy rather than a murder. He had 3 disciples who had witnessed the dismissal and would confirm every detail of the official story. The Regional Cultivation Authority had accepted the report without inquiry. He had absorbed the final portion of Rin's overflow energy the morning before the dismissal, and his own cultivation had advanced 2 levels. 2 levels in a morning, which had not happened to him in 15 years. He stood at his window looking at the training ground below and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum. He had a new outer disciple lined up, younger than Rin, with a similar rootless profile. The boy's name was Tef, and he had been grateful and eager at recruitment. Voss had explained the same things he had explained to Rin 9 years ago. He had used almost identical words and Tef had responded almost identically. He understood that this was a method now, refined and reliable. He began, quietly, to consider scaling it. One rootless disciple at a time was efficient but limited. 2 or 3 running simultaneously at different stages would produce a steadier stream. He brought this idea to his private journal and spent an evening working out the logistics. He presented at the next sect assembly with the confidence of someone whose position had never been more secure. 3 other elders deferred to his opinion on 2 separate cultivation theory questions. The sect master called him a cornerstone of the Ashen Peak lineage. He accepted this with appropriate humility. He drank with the other senior elders that evening and was generous and warm and recalled stories that made everyone laugh. He was very good at the performance of belonging. He had been doing it for 30 years and it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He went to bed that night with the specific contentment of a man who had eliminated his last remaining risk. The first thing to go wrong was a letter. Not a threatening letter, a routine one, from the Regional Cultivation Authority's records office. It requested clarification on a minor discrepancy in Elder Voss's submitted advancement fee records from 3 years prior. He read it twice and composed a reply that addressed the discrepancy as a transcription error. His reply was accepted and he considered the matter closed. The second thing was a conversation he overheard at the sect's market day. 2 merchants from Drenwick were discussing a rumor that someone was reviewing old energy transfer records from the mountain sects. The review was described as routine, a regional audit. He told himself it was routine. The third thing was the new disciple Tef mentioning, during a training session, that he had heard from his family in Drenwick that a woman in the records office had been asking questions. Voss asked what kind of questions. Tef said he wasn't sure, something about cultivation tax records. Voss dismissed the topic and changed the subject. That evening he pulled his private journal from its locked drawer and reviewed his own entries. Everything was in code, which he had been careful about. The code was good but it assumed the reader wouldn't know what they were looking for. If someone already knew what they were looking for, the code became easier. He locked the journal and sat with the lamp burning for a long time. The fourth thing was a name. The Regional Cultivation Authority sent a follow-up letter 2 weeks after the first. This one was signed by a senior records official and referenced a specific set of energy transfer logs from years 2 and 3 of a disciple's advancement. The disciple was not named in the letter. The description was precise enough that Voss knew exactly who it referred to. He wrote a reply that was longer than the first one and contained considerably more explanation. He waited for a response and did not sleep particularly well. The fifth thing was silence. No response came for 10 days. He had written 3 letters by the time the silence broke. When it broke, it was not with a letter. A Regional Cultivation Authority investigator arrived at the Ashen Peak sect's gate on a Tuesday morning. She was accompanied by 2 assistants and carried a sealed authorization from the Provincial Oversight Office. She asked to review Elder Voss's disciple records for the past 9 years. He received her in his formal study and was gracious and cooperative and felt the floor shifting under him. He saw Rin for the first time since the cliff on a market day in Drenwick. He had come to town to meet with a merchant contact and had not expected anything unusual. He was walking through the market when a young man carrying crates paused nearby. The young man set down the crates, straightened, and looked directly at him. For a moment Voss didn't recognize him. Then he did. The recognition arrived with a specific quality of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Rin looked different in a way that was hard to specify. Same face, same build, but something in the way he occupied space had changed entirely. He stood the way things stand when they are not concerned about what is around them. Voss had cultivated for 40 years and he could not read the energy Rin was carrying. He couldn't read it because it wasn't cultivation energy. It was something older and he had no framework for it. He said Rin's name, which was a mistake because it confirmed that the recognition went both ways. Rin looked at him with an expression that had no anger in it. No relief, no satisfaction, no grief. The expression of someone observing a fact. Voss asked him, with a composure he did not fully feel, how he was alive. Rin said he had landed somewhere unexpected. Voss asked what that meant. Rin said it meant he was alive and he was working at a warehouse and he hoped the elder's cultivation was going well. Then he picked up his crates and walked away. Voss stood in the market and watched him go and felt something he had not felt in 30 years. The specific helpless feeling of not knowing what a person was going to do next. He walked back to his merchant contact and completed his business and returned to the sect. He spent that evening in his formal study and did not open his private journal. He sat with the lamp and thought about the expression on Rin's face. No anger. That was the part he couldn't resolve. An angry person was manageable. A person with no anger and no urgency and no expression you could read was something else entirely. The Regional Cultivation Authority's investigation expanded 3 weeks after the investigators' first visit. The expansion was triggered by a formal submission from the Provincial Records Office. The submission contained a detailed analysis of energy transfer irregularities spanning 9 years. It also contained a signed testimony from a former disciple of Elder Voss. The testimony was specific, technical, and described the siphoning method in enough detail to be verified. It described the overflow energy extraction at each advancement level, the timing, the volume, the elder's cultivation gains. It described 3 years of a disciple cultivating from zero with no spiritual root while being systematically drained. The testimony was signed by Rin. The sect master received a copy the same morning the investigation expanded. He called an emergency council of the senior elders. Voss attended and said that the testimony was fabricated by a disgruntled, dismissed disciple. He said Rin had been dismissed for theft and had clearly constructed this account as revenge. He said the technical details could have been gathered from any cultivation manual. 3 senior elders looked at the testimony's specific energy transfer numbers and said the details couldn't have come from a manual. Voss said there were other explanations. The sect master asked him to provide one. He could not. The investigation authority arrived 2 days later with expanded authorization. They requested Voss's cultivation records for the same 9-year period covered by the testimony. They requested access to the sect's internal energy monitoring logs. They requested interviews with the 3 disciples who had witnessed Rin's dismissal. 2 of the 3 witnesses told investigators privately that the theft accusation had been prepared before Rin was informed of it. One of them said he had overheard Voss telling his senior assistant to draft the accusation 2 weeks before Rin was dismissed. The investigation took 12 days. On the 13th day, Elder Voss was formally suspended from his sect position pending a full tribunal. The suspension was announced at a sect assembly in the training ground. The training ground where Rin had knelt 6 months ago. The same assembled disciples. The same location. Everything else reversed. Rin was not at the sect assembly. He was in Drenwick at the warehouse, carrying stock on the same morning the announcement was made. Calla found him at the end of the workday with a document in her hand. It was a copy of the tribunal announcement, forwarded to the Provincial Records Office. She said she thought he would want to know. He read it, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. He thanked her, which he meant. She asked him what he was going to do now. He said he didn't know yet. He said there was still a new disciple at the sect named Tef who was 19 and rootless and believed what he had been told. He said the tribunal would handle Voss but it wouldn't handle the next Voss. Calla asked what he meant by that. He said the method existed whether or not the man did. He said someone needed to make sure the method was documented and known and could not be used quietly again. She asked if he was volunteering for that. He said he supposed he was. She said she supposed she could help with the record side of it. He said that would be useful. They were quiet for a moment in the late afternoon light. He looked at the mountain visible from the warehouse district, the peak of Ashen Peak above the clouds. He thought about the cliff. He thought about the 11 seconds. He thought about landing in a place that hadn't been aiming at him and finding something there that nobody intended. He decided that was probably the most important thing that had ever happened to him and he hadn't needed to do anything to deserve it. He picked up his bag and walked with Calla back toward the town center. He did not look at the mountain again. He had a God's dissolved remnant in his chest and a rootless cultivation that had never been done before and a list of things that still needed doing. That was enough. That was considerably more than enough. Tef was 19, rootless, and had been at the Ashen Peak sect for 4 months. He had been told by Elder Voss that his situation was unique and his potential was exceptional. He had been told that cultivation without a spiritual root required a different kind of dedication. He had believed all of this because he was 19 and wanted it to be true. He trained harder than anyone in the outer disciple division. He slept less, ate less, and spent his rest days in the cultivation hall instead of the town. He had reached level 2 of the mortal realm in 4 months, which was considered impressive for his situation. He did not know that level 2 in 4 months with no spiritual root had been done before. He did not know about Rin. Nobody at the sect mentioned Rin anymore. Rin had been removed from the sect records as a dismissed disciple, and the record contained only the theft accusation. Tef heard about the regional investigation through the Junior Disciple Gossip Network. He heard that Elder Voss was being investigated for cultivation record irregularities. He did not know what that meant for him specifically. He went to Elder Voss's study to ask and found it locked. He went to the senior disciple who handled his training schedule and was told to continue his routine. He continued his routine because he had no framework for doing anything else. On the third day after the investigator's arrival, Rin came to the Ashen Peak sect's gate. He did not go inside. He stood at the gate and asked the gate disciple to deliver a message to the outer disciple named Tef. The message was a location and a time, nothing else. Tef came to the location, which was a tea house at the base of the mountain road. He sat across from a young man he had never seen before and waited. Rin told him, without any particular softness, that Elder Voss had been cultivating by extracting energy from rootless disciples. He told him the investigation would confirm this and that Voss's position at the sect was finished. He told him the more important thing was what this meant for Tef specifically. Tef asked what it meant. Rin said it meant his cultivation gains over the past 4 months had been partly real and partly borrowed. He said the borrowed portion would stabilize when the extraction stopped, which it had already. He said Tef's actual foundation was solid and his progress was his own. Tef asked how he knew this. Rin said he knew because he had been in the same situation 3 years earlier. Tef was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked why Rin was telling him this instead of letting him find out from the investigation. Rin said because finding out from an investigation report was a different experience than finding out from someone who had already survived it. Tef asked if Rin had survived it. Rin said he was sitting in the tea house, so yes. Tef looked at him for a moment and then ordered tea. That was the beginning of a longer conversation. They talked for 3 hours. Rin told him everything except the god's domain, which he was not ready to explain to anyone yet. He told him about the siphoning method, how it worked, what the signs were. He told him what questions to ask the investigation authority when they interviewed him. He told him which details would be useful to the investigators and which were better kept back until asked directly. Tef listened to all of it with the focused attention of someone who had just had the floor moved under him. When Rin finished, Tef asked what he should do now. Rin said he should go back to the sect, cooperate with the investigation, and keep training. He said his rootless cultivation was real and the method was his and no one had taken that from him. Tef asked if he could ask Rin questions sometimes. Rin said yes. He said there was a warehouse in Drenwick where he could usually be found during the day. Tef said he would come when he could. Rin walked back to Drenwick and told Kala about the conversation. Kala said that was kind of him. Rin said it wasn't about being kind. He said the method existed and Tef was going to encounter the next version of it somewhere unless someone made sure he could recognize it. Kala said that was also kind, just described differently. Rin didn't argue with that. The Ashen Peak sect's internal investigation took 3 weeks to complete. It was conducted by the Regional Cultivation Authority with assistance from the Provincial Oversight Office. The lead investigator was a woman named Inspector Sean who had been doing this work for 20 years. She had seen cultivation fraud cases before, but she had not seen one this technically sophisticated. The siphoning method Voss had developed required an understanding of overflow energy dynamics that was genuinely advanced. She noted in her report that the method had been built incrementally over at least 15 years. She noted that it had been used on at least 2 disciples before Rin, both of whom had left the sect under circumstances that were now being reviewed. She interviewed 43 people over the 3 weeks. She interviewed Rin on the 9th day, in a formal office in Drenwick. Rin answered every question directly and without visible emotion. She noted in her interview record that he was the clearest witness she had spoken to in the case. She asked him at the end of the interview how he felt about the investigation. He said he thought it was necessary and he hoped it covered the method as well as the man. She asked what he meant. He said the technical documentation of how the siphoning worked should be distributed to cultivation authorities across the region. He said if the method remained undocumented it would be rediscovered by someone else eventually. She said that was a reasonable observation and asked if he would be willing to provide a technical account. He said yes. He spent 2 afternoons with her assistant writing out the method in full technical detail. It was the most thorough documentation of a cultivation fraud technique that the regional authority had ever received. Inspector Sean signed off on the final report on the 22nd day. Elder Voss was suspended on the 23rd day. The tribunal date was set for 60 days after the suspension. The sect master issued a formal apology to former disciples affected by the investigation. It was a careful, legally worded apology that said everything required and nothing additional. Rin read it in the warehouse on a Tuesday and set it aside. He understood the difference between institutional apology and actual accountability. He was not angry about the difference. He simply noted it as information about how these things worked. 3 months after arriving in Drenwick, Rin began to understand what the authority inside him actually did. He had been treating it the way he treated cultivation energy, as a resource to be conserved and carefully deployed. He was wrong about this. It did not work like a resource. It worked like a perspective. When he was near a situation that involved genuine injustice, it didn't fill him with power. It filled him with clarity. He could see the structure of a situation the way you see the structure of a building. He could see which walls were load-bearing and which were decorative. He could see the exact point where a single action would cause something large to shift. This was not the same as being able to fix everything. It was the ability to see what mattered and what was noise. He began to understand why the god had dissolved 3 centuries ago. Not because the god had lost, but because the god had seen everything clearly enough to understand that being a fixed point was not useful. A god who dissolved into a domain and waited for the right vessel could do what the vessel was positioned to do. He found this unsettling and then found it clarifying and then found it simply true. He told Kala about the authority 3 months in, which was earlier than he had intended. He told her because she had noticed that he sometimes paused before speaking and that when he spoke it was always relevant. She had asked him directly what was going on. He told her about the domain, the dissolved god, the authority that grew with consequence. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if it was dangerous. He said he didn't think so. She asked if he was certain. He said no. She said that was an honest answer and asked what she should do with the information. He said nothing for now, and that he would tell her if that changed. She said she appreciated that he had told her. He said he had told her because she was the only person who had noticed something was different and hadn't pretended otherwise. She said that was the only reasonable response to noticing something. He agreed. 8 weeks after the Voss tribunal, Kala brought him a new file. It had arrived through the Provincial Records Office and had been flagged as potentially related to the Voss case. It concerned a different sect, 3 mountains east, called the Iron Hollow sect. The discrepancy was smaller than the Voss case and less technically sophisticated, but the pattern was recognizable. A senior elder with an unusually high cultivation advancement rate. 3 rootless outer disciples over 8 years, each leaving the sect under unhappy circumstances. No direct evidence, only numbers that didn't align when placed against each other. Rin read the file twice. The authority in him felt the structure of it clearly. He told Kala the numbers were sufficient to warrant a formal inquiry but not a full investigation. He told her what specific additional records would make the inquiry conclusive. He told her exactly which cultivation monitoring logs from which years would show the pattern unmistakably. Kala looked at him and said that was very specific. He said he had spent 9 years inside the method so he knew where it left marks. She said she would submit the inquiry request. She submitted it with a detailed technical addendum that explained which records to request and why. The provincial authority approved the inquiry within a week. Rin did not submit anything under his own name. He provided the technical analysis to Kala and she incorporated it into her official filing. This was not modesty. It was precision. His name attached to the filing would make it about him, about Voss, about the personal history. The filing needed to be about the method. The Iron Hollow inquiry was approved, conducted, and resulted in a suspension within 3 months. Kala handled the documentation. Rin handled the analysis. They did not discuss what it was they were building. They were both too practical for that. They simply moved to the next file. Elder Voss's tribunal was held 60 days after his suspension as scheduled. It took place in the Provincial Cultivation Authority's formal chamber in the nearest city. Rin was not required to attend but chose to. He sat in the public gallery and watched the proceedings without visible expression. Voss arrived in formal sect robes that he was technically no longer entitled to wear. No one corrected this, which told Rin something about how confident Voss still was. The tribunal panel consisted of 3 senior cultivation authority officials and 2 independent sect masters. Inspector Sean presented the investigation findings over the course of a full morning. She was precise and exhaustive and clearly had done this before. The energy transfer records were presented as visual overlays, Voss's advancement gains mapped against his disciples' advancement losses. The pattern was visible to everyone in the room. Voss's representation argued that energy transfer between master and disciple was a recognized cultivation phenomenon. He argued that what had been characterized as siphoning was a form of resonance cultivation that benefited both parties. The tribunal asked him to explain the two previous disciples who had left the sect in adverse circumstances. He said their departures had been unrelated to their cultivation work. The tribunal asked him to explain why both of those disciples' cultivation had stalled permanently after leaving. He said cultivation stalls had many causes. The tribunal asked him to explain the technical document Rin had submitted, which described the method in precise operational detail. He said the document was fabricated by a disgruntled former disciple. The tribunal noted that the document's technical accuracy had been verified by 3 independent cultivation experts. Voss had no response to that. The verdict was delivered after a 2-hour deliberation. Permanent revocation of his cultivation authority certification. Permanent ban from holding any position in any registered sect. Mandatory restitution to the 3 identified disciples, including Rin. A formal directive to distribute the method documentation to all regional cultivation authorities. Rin sat in the public gallery and listened to all of it. He did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had expected something: resolution, completion, the specific satisfaction of a closed chapter. He felt none of that. What he felt was the same thing the authority in him always felt near genuine structural change. Clarity. The tribunal had ended one instance of the method. The method itself was now documented, which meant it was harder to use quietly. That was meaningful, but it was not finished. He walked out of the tribunal chamber into the street and stood in the afternoon light. Tef was waiting outside. He had come from the sect on his own and had sat in the gallery on the other side. They walked together toward the transit station without immediate conversation. Tef said eventually that he had expected it to feel like more. Rin said yes. Tef asked if that was normal. Rin said he thought it was honest. He said the end of a bad thing was not the same as the beginning of a good one. He said they were different events that sometimes happen near each other. Tef thought about that for a while. Then he asked what came next. Rin said there was a list. The list had 7 items on it when Rin first wrote it down. By the time the Iron Hollow case closed, it had 14. He kept it in a plain notebook that he carried in his inner pocket. Kala had a copy in the provincial records office, filed under a category that didn't attract casual attention. Each item was a sect or an elder or a practice that the authority in him had flagged as carrying the specific structural signature of systematic exploitation. Not all of them were cultivation siphoning. 2 were resource misclassification schemes that were slowly draining outer disciple stipends. 1 was a training debt arrangement that bound disciples to a sect for terms they hadn't understood when they signed. 1 was a false lineage certification network that was selling fake cultivation heritage documents to families who wanted their children to have better sect placement. They were all different in their specifics. They all worked the same way. They all depended on people with less power trusting people with more power in environments designed to make that trust feel mandatory. Kala had stopped being surprised by this after the 4th case. She had started being organized about it, which was more useful. She created a filing system for the cases that allowed her to track them across different stages simultaneously. She started corresponding with 2 other records officials in neighboring provinces who had been noticing similar patterns. She did not explain Rin to them. She explained the pattern and the documentation methodology and asked if they had seen it in their records. Both of them said yes. By the end of the year, Kala was coordinating with 11 records officials across 4 provinces. Rin did not appear in any of their correspondence. He was the analysis, not the name. He had been the name once, the testimony, the signed document. He understood now that the name was sometimes necessary and often a distraction. He was more effective as the thinking behind the filing. Tef visited the warehouse in Drenwick every 2 weeks. He had been assigned a new teaching elder after the investigation, one who had been vetted by the tribunal process. His cultivation was progressing steadily and on its own terms now, without the extraction. He told Rin once that his cultivation felt different since the investigation, cleaner. Rin said that was what it felt like when the energy was actually yours. Tef said he wished he had known the difference earlier. Rin said knowing the difference required knowing there was a difference to know. He said that was why the documentation mattered. Tef said he wanted to help with the list. Rin said he would think about how that was possible. He thought about it for 2 weeks and then told Tef that the most useful thing he could do was stay at the sect. He said a person on the inside who knew what to look for was more valuable than another person on the outside looking in. He said when Tef advanced to inner disciple, he would have access to records that no external investigator could request. He said when Tef became a senior disciple, he would have the kind of standing that made accusations legible rather than dismissible. Tef said that would take years. Rin said yes. Tef said that sounded like a long plan. Rin said it was the right length for what it needed to do. The authority in Rin grew the way he had been told it would. Not with training, with consequence. Every case that resulted in a real change added something to it. Not power in the cultivator's sense of more energy, more force, more speed. Something more like depth. He began to perceive things at greater distance. Not physically, structurally. He could feel the weight of an unjust arrangement from further away. He could read the load-bearing points of a corrupt system before he had the documentation to prove it. He became more careful as he became more capable. Not because the authority made him dangerous in a way that required caution. Because clarity without patience was just impatience with better vision. He had spent 9 years being trained to mistake endurance for strategy. He was done with that. He kept working at the warehouse. Kodo had promoted him to supervisor after 6 months, which meant he managed the other stock carriers and handled the scheduling. He was good at it. He was good at almost everything that involved understanding how pieces fit together and which ones could be moved. The warehouse job was useful in a different way than the analysis work. It kept him in the town, it kept him visible as an ordinary person, and it paid him consistently. He had learned from the cliff that visibility as ordinary was protective in a way that cultivator status never had been. A cultivator with an unusual ability was a target. A warehouse supervisor with no registered cultivation was furniture. He preferred being furniture. He also, more quietly, found that he liked the work itself. He liked the specific problem of organizing a warehouse efficiently. He liked Kodo's complete lack of interest in his history. He liked the other workers, who had their own problems and their own small dignities and did not particularly care what he was capable of. He had spent 9 years in a sect where every interaction was filtered through cultivation rank. He had not understood how much that cost until he was somewhere it didn't apply. A year after the cliff, he went back. He had been thinking about it for months and had been putting it off for reasons he couldn't fully name. He traveled to the mountain alone and on foot, which took 4 days. He stood at the base of the cliff and looked at the drop. It was significant. He walked along the cliff's base until he found the place where the air changed. It was still there, the domain's boundary, the same thin edge of awareness he had stepped through a year ago. He stepped through. The violet sky was the same. The silverbark trees were the same. The god's presence was the same, which meant it was everywhere and patient and had been waiting. He sat down in the domain and was quiet for a long time. The god's presence communicated the way it always did, not in words but in understanding. It asked him, in the way it asked things, how the authority was settling. He said he thought it was settling correctly. He said he was using it the way you use a compass, not the way you use a weapon. The presence indicated that this was the correct use. He asked the presence whether it had intended this. He asked whether it had been waiting specifically for him or waiting for anyone who fell from that cliff with a shattered core. The answer was both and neither. It had been waiting for the right configuration of emptiness and intention. He had been the first person to arrive with both. He asked what happened when he died. The answer was that the authority would not die with him. It would return to the domain and wait for the next configuration. He asked how many times this had happened before. The answer was 4. He asked what happened to the others. The answer was that they had each done what they were positioned to do. He asked if that was supposed to be reassuring. The presence communicated something that felt like honesty rather than reassurance. He sat with that for a while. Then he thanked the domain, which felt strange but correct. He stepped back through the boundary and walked down the mountain. He did not count the seconds this time. The 14th item on the list was different from the others. The others were individual elders, isolated practices, contained corruptions. The 14th was a network. It was called the Hollow Arrangement, which was not an official name. It was the name Rin had given it in his notebook because it described what it did accurately. The Hollow Arrangement was a loose coordination between 11 senior elders across 6 sects in 2 pro. They did not meet formally and they did not share documentation. They shared methods. When one of them developed an effective exploitation technique, it moved laterally through the network by demonstration and implication. Not taught, absorbed. They had collectively been running some version of rootless disciple extraction for between 12 and 20 years. Rin had identified the network's existence from a pattern across 6 otherwise unrelated investigation files. Each file had a technical detail that was too specific to be independent invention. Each file had a method variation that built incrementally on the previous case. Someone had been learning from each prosecution and adjusting the method to avoid the same documentation trail. The Hollow Arrangement was not paranoid or organized. It was adaptive. He brought the notebook to Kala on a Wednesday morning and showed her the 14th item. She read it twice and said it was going to be more difficult than the others. He said he knew. She asked how he wanted to approach it. He said carefully and without his name attached. She said that was the same approach as everything else. He said yes, but this time the network would recognize the approach if they had been paying attention. He said the documentation methodology they had been using had become identifiable. 6 prosecutions with the same filing structure, the same technical addendum format, the same record request patterns. An adaptive network would have noticed by now. Kala said she had also noticed that. She said she had already started varying her filing approach on the last 2 cases for exactly that reason. He looked at her. She said she had assumed he would eventually identify something larger and she had started preparing for it. He said that was the most useful thing anyone had done in connection with his work. She said she was a records official, it was her job to maintain usable systems. He said he had genuinely not expected this level of forward thinking from anyone. She said she would try not to take that personally. He said she shouldn't, it was a compliment about her specifically. She said she knew and told him to get back to the problem. He spent 6 weeks mapping the network before doing anything else. He worked from the case files backward, tracing the technical evolution of the method across all 6 prosecutions. He identified 4 core nodes, for elders whose method variations had been adopted by others. He identified 7 peripheral nodes whose variations were derivative rather than original. The core nodes were the problem. The peripheral nodes were symptoms. Kala's provincial network had grown to 19 records officials by this point. He told her he needed information from outside their current coverage area. She said she could reach out to 3 officials in the 2nd province if he could tell her what to look for. He gave her a precise description of the documentation signature, the specific combination of record omissions that the method left behind. Not the method itself, the absence of documentation that should exist. The places where records had been trimmed rather than fabricated. Kala sent the description to her 3 external contacts. 2 of them responded within a week with files that matched the signature exactly. He now had 11 files, 6 prosecuted cases and 5 new ones. He spread them across the floor of Kala's office on a Saturday afternoon when no one else was in the building. They spent 4 hours building the map. The 4 core nodes became visible. He sat back and looked at the map and felt the authority in him reading the structure clearly. He could see exactly what would happen if they prosecuted the peripheral nodes first. The core nodes would adapt. They would change their documentation practices, distance themselves from the peripheral elders, and the network would survive in a smaller form. He told Kala they needed to move on all 4 core nodes simultaneously. She said that was a significantly larger operation than anything they had done before. He said yes. She asked if they had the evidence for all 4. He said they had sufficient evidence for 3 and preliminary documentation for the 4th. She said that wasn't enough for the 4th. He said he knew. He said they needed to build the 4th case while holding the other 3 in preparation. He said that would take time and the other nodes would continue operating while they waited. Kala said that was a hard calculation. He said it was the right calculation. She said she believed him and that it was still hard. He said yes. Tef had become an inner disciple 14 months after the investigation. It had taken him longer than the standard timeline and he had not cared about that at all. He had been focused on building a foundation that was entirely his own. He had also been paying attention. When he wrote to Rin about what he had noticed from inside the sect's inner disciple records, Rin read the letter 3 times. Tef had identified a pattern in the sect's master-disciple assignment process. Senior elders with high advancement rates were being systematically paired with rootless applicants. The pairing was framed as a mentorship opportunity for underserved disciples. It was in the sect's formal placement documentation as a charitable practice. Tef had found 3 years of placement records and mapped the advancement rates of the elders against their rootless disciple assignments. The correlation was not subtle. He had also found a private correspondence archive between 2 of the core node elders that referenced the placement system as a resource allocation mechanism. The correspondence didn't name what it was doing. It didn't need to. Rin read the private correspondence summary and felt the authority in him settle into something very clear. This was the 4th case. He wrote back to Tef and told him to copy the correspondence archive carefully and exactly and send it through Kala's official channels. He told him not to discuss it with anyone at the sect. He told him the information was enough to complete the network map. Tef wrote back asking if this was dangerous. Rin said it was possible and that Tef should proceed only if he was comfortable with that. Tef said he was comfortable. He sent the archive through Kala's channels 10 days later. It arrived in a sealed provincial records envelope with a routing slip that did not indicate its origin. Kala added it to the fourth case file. The fourth case was now complete. He told Kala they were ready. She spent a week reviewing all 4 files. She said they were ready. Kala submitted all 4 cases simultaneously to the Provincial Cultivation Authority on a Monday morning. She submitted them under 4 different case numbers, through 4 different investigative channels. She submitted the technical addendum as a 5th separate document, connecting all 4 cases to the same network signature. She did not submit them all herself. She coordinated with 4 different records officials across 2 provinces, each submitting 1 case from their own jurisdiction. The submissions arrived at the provincial authority within the same 90-minute window. It was precisely the kind of simultaneous multi-jurisdictional submission that signaled a coordinated investigation rather than 4 independent complaints. The provincial authority elevated it immediately to the Regional Cultivation Council. The Regional Council had not seen a coordinated network prosecution in 11 years. They assigned 5 investigators. Rin heard about the assignment from Kala 2 days after the submission. He was in the warehouse sorting a delivery when she came in. She told him 5 investigators had been assigned. He nodded and continued sorting the delivery. She said 5 was significant. He said it was appropriate. She said she had expected more reaction. He said the reaction was that the work was done and now the process was handling it. She said she had been working on this for a year and a half and she thought she deserved more than equanimity. He stopped sorting and turned to look at her. He said she deserved considerably more than equanimity. He said she had built a network of 19 officials, developed a documentation methodology that would be used for decades, and had just executed the most complex simultaneous submission the provincial authority had received in over a decade. He said the equanimity was his problem, not a reflection of the work's importance. She said that was better. He said he meant it. She said she knew and went back to the records office. He watched her go and went back to the delivery. He was, he noted, considerably better at warehouse work than at expressing appropriate appreciation. He filed this as something to work on. The hollow arrangement investigation took 4 months. It was conducted simultaneously across 2 provinces by 5 investigators with access to a documentation base that had been building for a year and a half. The 4 core node elders were suspended within the first month. The 7 peripheral nodes were suspended within the second. 3 of the 4 core nodes attempted to negotiate reduced penalties by providing information about the others. The investigators accepted the information and applied it to the prosecution of the remaining 1. They did not reduce the penalties. The penalties for the core nodes were the most significant cultivation fraud convictions the region had seen. Permanent revocation, permanent sect bans, mandatory restitution to 23 identified disciples across 6 sects. The formal directive this time required all regional cultivation authorities to implement a new monitoring protocol. The protocol was based on the documentation methodology Kala had developed. Her name was on the protocol. Rin's name was not. He had been listed as a contributing technical expert in the background documentation. Contributing technical expert was accurate and invisible, which was exactly correct. The 23 identified disciples included 11 who had left their sects under adverse circumstances over the past 12 years. Each of them received formal notification that their cases had been reviewed and resolved. Rin received his notification at the warehouse. It was a standard form letter from the restitution office. It was addressed to former disciple Rin, formerly of the Ashen Peak sect. He read it and put it in his pocket with the earlier tribunal announcement. He had 2 formal letters from the Cultivation Authority now. He did not know why he kept them. He kept them anyway. 2 years after the cliff, Rin was still working at the warehouse. Kodo had offered to make him a partner in the business 3 months earlier. Rin had said he would think about it. He was still thinking about it. The list in his notebook now had 22 items. 11 were closed. 11 were in various stages of documentation or active investigation. The provincial monitoring protocol that Kala had built was now in use across 3 provinces. It had flagged 14 new potential cases in its first 6 months of operation. Rin had reviewed the documentation for 9 of them and confirmed 8 as warranting investigation. He had done this from the warehouse office during lunch hours. Kala had submitted the 8 referrals through her network. 6 had resulted in active investigations. This was, Rin thought, a reasonable efficiency rate. Tef had become a senior disciple. He had done it in 3 years, which was faster than standard by almost a year. He had done it by cultivating consistently and building a foundation that had no gaps. He was also, quietly, the most reliable source of internal sect information in the provincial network. Not a spy, exactly. Someone who paid attention and knew who to tell. He visited the warehouse less frequently now because he had more responsibilities at the sect. When he did visit, he and Rin talked about cultivation theory for hours. Rin had no cultivation in the registered sense and had not had any for 2 years. He had something else that was not registered anywhere and grew with every consequence he was part of. Tef said once that talking to Rin about cultivation felt different from talking to any of his teaching elders. He said it felt like the conversation assumed he was going to figure things out rather than telling him what the answer was. Rin said that was because he didn't know what the answer was, he only knew how to think about the question. Tef said that was the same thing. Rin said it wasn't, but he appreciated the perspective. He understood the authority fully, or as fully as he was going to, about 20 months in. It was not a weapon and it was not a shield. It was a faculty. The way sight was a faculty or hearing. It allowed him to perceive things that other people couldn't perceive. Specifically, it allowed him to perceive the structural relationship between power and the people power was applied to. He could see when a relationship was extractive. He could see when an institution was built to benefit the people running it at the expense of the people inside it. He could see the precise mechanism by which a corrupt arrangement maintained itself. He could not fix these things directly. The authority gave him no ability to force an outcome. It gave him the ability to understand the exact intervention that would allow the outcome to fix itself. This was a meaningful distinction. A God who forced outcomes created dependency. A God who understood what was needed and made space for it to happen created capacity. The dissolved God had understood this, which was why dissolving had been the right choice. Rin was not a God. He was a person carrying a fragment of a dissolved God's perception. He had 2 letters from the cultivation authority in his pocket and a notebook with 22 items. He had a warehouse job and a promotion offer he was still considering. He had an ally who was quietly building a monitoring system that would outlast both of them. He had a former disciple who was building a cultivation foundation that no one could drain. He was not finished. He was not going to be finished. That was fine. 6 months after the network prosecution, Rin received a formal invitation. It was from the Ashen Peak sect's new acting sect master. The new acting sect master was a woman named Elder Mira who had been on the tribunal that removed Voss. She had been appointed to stabilize the sect's senior administration during the transition period. The invitation was to visit the sect as a recognized former disciple. Not as a guest, not as a petitioner. As a recognized former disciple who had contributed to the resolution of a significant case. He read the invitation twice and thought about it for 3 days. He went. He traveled up the mountain on foot, which took 2 days, the same route he had taken as a 19-year-old recruit. The sect looked the same. The training ground looked the same. He stood at the training ground's edge and looked at the cliff visible through the eastern gate. The cliff was the same cliff. He had fallen 11 seconds from that cliff 2 years ago. He had been a different person when he fell. He had also been, in some ways, already himself. Elder Mira received him in the formal reception hall. She was direct and practical and had the specific efficiency of someone managing a complicated situation. She thanked him for the technical documentation and the testimony. She said the sect was working to rebuild the outer disciple program with better oversight structures. She said she wanted to ask him directly if he was willing to consult on what those structures should include. He said yes. He spent 2 days at the sect meeting with the new outer disciple administration. He walked them through the documentation methodology and what to look for in cultivation records. He met with the outer disciples collectively and answered questions for an afternoon. He told them what he would have wanted someone to tell him at 19. He told them their progress was their own. He told them if it ever stopped feeling like their own, that was information worth paying attention to. He did not see the cliff again before he left. He had seen it from the training ground and that was enough. He went back to the domain for the second time 18 months after the first visit. The boundary was exactly where he had left it. He stepped through. The violet sky, the silver bark trees, the god's patient presence. He sat down and was quiet. The presence asked, in the way it asked things, what he had been doing. He said he had been working. He described the list, the network, the protocol, Tef, Kala, the 19 records officials who were now 26. He described the tribunal and the restitution letters and the new outer disciple oversight program. The presence communicated something that felt like the satisfaction of something working correctly. He asked whether the god had known this was what would happen. The answer was that it had known the authority would be used correctly. It had not known the specific form that would take. He asked whether the god cared about the specific form. The answer was no. He asked why not. The answer was that caring about specific forms was a property of fixed things. Dissolved things were interested in outcomes, not methods. He said he thought he understood that. The presence communicated that understanding it was sufficient. He asked whether there was more it needed from him. The answer was that there was nothing it needed. The authority was his. What he did with it was entirely his decision. He sat with that for a long time. He had spent 9 years in a sect where everything was evaluated against an external standard. He had spent 2 years building something with no external standard except whether it worked. He found he preferred the second. He thanked the domain again. He stepped back through the boundary. He did not look back at the violet sky. He had what he needed from it. He came back to Drenwick on a Tuesday. The market was running. He stopped at the tea house where he had first met Calla and ordered a cup. She found him there 20 minutes later, which meant someone at the warehouse had told her he was back. She sat down across from him and asked how the mountain was. He said it was the same. She asked how the sect was. He said it was trying to become something different. She said that was more than most institutions managed. He said yes. She told him that the monitoring protocol had been formally adopted by a 4th province while he was gone. He said that was significant. She said she thought so. She told him that Tef had sent a letter about a situation at the sect that he thought warranted attention. He asked if it was on the list. She said she had already added it. He nodded. He drank his tea. She drank her tea. Outside the tea house the market was running, the same market it had been when he arrived in Drenwick 2 years ago. He had arrived with nothing, a shattered core and a borrowed room and a warehouse job. He had arrived with 11 seconds of falling and a place he had not been meant to land. He had arrived with no power in the cultivator's sense and more clarity than he knew what to do with. He had done what he was positioned to do. He was not finished doing it. The list had 22 items. The 23rd was already forming. He set down his cup and asked Calla what Tef's letter said. She took it out and they read it together. Outside, the market continued. The mountain was visible in the distance, the cliff on its eastern face a thin line from here. He did not look at it. He was reading. He had work to do.